Western educational philosophy, ec- particularly the philosophy of existentialism, by Danny Rafferty and Wayde Bowker, narrated by Danny Rafferty. So let's talk about some of the history and tenets of existentialism, but first let's answer the question, what is existentialism? Uh, if you ever ask a philosopher, what is existentialism? They'll typically answer with this quote, that essence precedes existence. Now, that's not necessarily attributed to any one person. That's just kind of like a general definition of what existentialism is, the belief that we come to know truth uh, by choice. The individual self must ultimately decide what is true and how we know that it's true. Whether we choose logic, intuition, the scientific method, or revelation, that's irrelevant. What matters is that we must eventually choose. Now, out of this belief, there's many assumptions that develop. You might, just after hearing that very first summary of what existentialism is, think that this is an anti-theist philosophy, but it's not necessarily. Although many atheist philosophies come out of this, including that one that says that there's neither meaning or purpose to the physical universe. Because we live in a world without purpose, we must create our own subjective meaning or reality. By our choices, we determine reality. Now, that is a rational assumption that comes out of the existentialist belief. However, there are also other beliefs that come out of it. But first, let's talk about how this philosophy falls under different genres. When you're talking about the nature of reality in metaphysics, the existence precedes essence. There you go. You see that quote popping up again. That the idea is that we exist before we have a purpose. As an individual, we determine what our reality is, what our purpose is by choice. And then when we're talking about epistemology, the nature of knowledge, in this genre, the individual is responsible for their own personal knowledge. And this could be something that's very helpful when talking about education. If we're going to talk about values or morality, and we're talking about axiology, that our values our values consist of our personal choices. So it's our personal choices define what our values are, as opposed to saying our values define what our choices are, which might be a more traditional way of understanding that. If we're going to talk about the nature of a learner, in particular with education, this is where I personally think that existential philosophy really, I think, has a lot to offer us. And that's that an individual, a student, is capable of authentic and responsible choices, meaning that a student has the responsibility of learning. Nobody else has that responsibility. A teacher can influence them, parents can influence, but ultimately the responsibility comes to the student. Now, then what's the purpose of schooling? Well, education should stress individual responsibility and choice then. If that's the case, if we're going to assume that students are responsible and able, then the assumption should be that they are responsible. Then the result of that should be that schools should also be emphasizing the fact that students are responsible for their own education. Is there, of course, things that teachers and administrators can do? Of course, but ultimately the responsibility does fall on the student. Now, when we're talking about our curriculum and instruction, all right, when we're talking about humanities, our values and education, these things need to be taught through self-discovery. Okay, that through self-discovery, students choosing their own, having a say-so in the process, and the Socratic method, which we'll get into later. Now let's talk about the history and the tenets of. We're still talking about them. Just to kind of give a little more overview of existentialism. Okay, originally existentialism was developed as a response to a more objective philosophy, other philosophies like mathematics and science, because these things were becoming very, very popular. This is when Kierkegaard started to ask, maybe there's a less objective way to approach things. But again, not necessarily going against the idea of the existence of God. So let's not think of it's easy to jump to that conclusion, but Um, but the idea of existentialism is to oppose anything that promotes social control or subjugation. Uh, Basically, taking the power away from these very objective, absolute truths that have been known over the centuries, I guess you could say, to subject people and control people on a social level. And so by creating more subjective truths, it creates less of an imbalance of power. Existentialism is neither a theistic or atheistic belief, as I've been saying. The father of existentialism, Soren Kierkegaard, he was a Christian, and his intention was to think about the responsibility that we have as individuals to make decisions and shape our purpose in our life, and our desperate need for a savior. So it's not that there is no purpose, that, his intention wasn't to make this an absolute process that all purpose in all of creation is only comes from the individual. It doesn't mean that there still can't be a purpose bestowed upon us by God. It's just showing that our purpose, if taking down this trail, could lead us to a very hopeless conclusion, which means we have a desperate need for a savior. Now, existential atheists take the existential premise and they extend it to the existence of all truth. Okay, and this is because this is a quote here, because there are no absolutes, no authorities, and no single or correct way to truth. The only authority is the authority of the self. Basically, they've made all truth relative. They've extended this philosophy to apply to all truth when that was not necessarily the original intention. So even within existentialism, you kind of have different categories and different branches, if you will. Now let's talk about some influential proponents of existentialism. Originally, of course, Soren Kierkegaard, 1813 to 1855. All right, the origins of the name existentialism, they lie in Soren Kierkegaard's 1813 to his use of the word existence, all right, which means existence in the special sense in which human individuals are said to exist. Now, Kierkegaard was reacting against the idealism of Hegel, all right, and that idealism implied that the world of living followed a pattern of a particular process of thought, and so he was basically developed existentialism as a response to idealism. And then we get to Edmund Husserl in 1859. He's the father of what we know as phenomenology and hermeneutics. All right, phenomenology, I can't pronounce that, I apologize. Phenomenology, there we go, I got it. Phenomenology is it strips away any presuppositions and assumptions of culture in order to discover meaning. So it's taking away how culture has affected, and the world and life has affected something, and tries to look beneath that or beyond that and try to discover meaning, because obviously we've experienced how culture can definitely lead to biases and clouded truths. Hermeneutics is the interpretation of lived experience. It's basically saying, how do you interpret what has happened? What's the meaning behind it based off of what has occurred? Then we move to I apologize. Edmund Husserl also developed the I-thou relationship philosophy, meaning relationships with others enhance one's spiritual life and relationship with God. So again, it's putting the personal responsibility on the individual. It says, hey, your personal choices and to have relationships with others will enhance your spiritual relationship, your spiritual life, and your relationship with God ultimately. If we skip ahead, we have A.S. Neal, 1883. He was a well-known educational existentialist. He established a school in the United Kingdom after World War I that was founded on the principle of learning by discovery in an atmosphere of unrestricted freedom, totally flipping the traditional sense of education on its head by really giving students a lot of freedom to decide how and what they're going to learn. All right, and then we have Jean-Paul Sartre. He coined the term "existence precedes essence." There we go. We have that word again. I know earlier I said that it didn't necessarily come from one particular person, but this is the guy. John Paul Sartre. He believed that since God does not exist, that humanity exists without meaning until they construct their own meaning. Uh, since we have free choice, we are complete responsibility for one's own continued existence. Okay, so it's the idea that God doesn't exist, so that means that we have to find our own purpose. This is where he kind of comes into play. So then we moved down to Maxine Greene. All right, Maxine Greene impacted education by promoting education as a means to teach students to nurture a specific kind of self-reflectiveness and expressiveness, and learning to learn. All right, without the ability to think about yourself, to reflect on your own life, there is really no awareness, no consciousness, is what she would say. So, again, it's saying that you have to be able to self-reflect, be self-aware, and self-conscious if you're ever actually going to learn anything, because, frankly, we get in our own way more often than not. And this is kind of where we're left at now, up until this point. This is where the rest of our presentation here is going to take a turn as we focus on particularly education, existentialism in education. Now, how does existentialism influence teachers, administrators, and servant leaders? Well, existentialism challenges teachers, administrators, and servant leaders to take a different approach in the way that they interact with students. Since existentialism is individualistic, influencers in students' lives best serve them by being present and introducing them to new ideas or possibilities. It's so fun. I'm reading these things, and I'm trying so hard to focus on reading them nice and clear for this presentation. And so I'm not even focused on what I'm actually saying. So let me read that again. Or let me just paraphrase this, what I just read once again. So existentialism challenges teachers, right? It makes us approach education in a different way in how we interact with the students, okay? And it does that in the way that we're going to talk about here in this next quote. By emphasizing teaching over learning and intensification of the subjective import of the material for students, such that the how of the material takes priority over the what, in ways that that foreground the material dynamics of existence. The emergence of newness, which might include new habits or subjective qualities, through an encounter that can be described as an event. All right. What does that mean? That's some language there, okay? That means that the idea is teaching is a priority over learning, which you would think if the responsibility is on the student, then learning would be the responsibility. But no, when it comes to when a teacher when a teacher understands that the responsibility of learning is on the student, they no longer have to focus on that. They focus on teaching as the teacher. So what's happening is everybody's taking their own personal responsibility. So a teacher emphasizes teaching, a learner emphasizes learning. They're not focused on how things are being taught. They're just trying to learn. They need to take responsibility for learning. Now, what this does is this really interrupts. Well, actually, that's the next slide. So let's finish this really quick. So this differs from the long-standing thought that teachers and administrators are to present information to students, and the students are there to receive it, right? But it is more intentional that requires teachers, administrators, and servant leaders to ensure students are challenged in their own thought process. All right, this is through the exposure of the new. So the idea is that teachers are not just going to focus on what kids can understand very easily, right? They need to actually change the way that students think, as opposed to just accommodate the way that they already think. All right. As a teacher, if you can't help change and develop a student to something different than what they already are, then you're no more useful than a textbook, which is what we're going to talk about here. So, the second quality is an emphasis on the contingency of teaching. It is possible that despite a professor's claims to authority, students are not actually being taught. And this is according to Jaresma. They're not actually being taught in a given course. All right? It's also possible that while students might learn knowledge in ways that do not disturb their assumptions or conceptual frameworks, leaving them indifferent, as Kierkegaard's pseudonym Climacus might say, they have a course without having encountered the philosophy of the new. This is key because the transformative effects of teaching hinge upon the very possibility of the new. So this doesn't mean, he's not saying here that it means new information. We're not talking about new information. We're talking about new ways to perceive things, new ways to understand, new ways of thinking. It's not just about knowledge. It's not just about what, okay? It's about how, which is a big deal. So you keep hearing this term, in the possibility of the new, something different, something new that's going to really, influence students. Maybe not even change their mind, but at least expose them to something different than what they already know, which is going to challenge them. And if they take the personal responsibility of learning, it's going to benefit them a whole lot more. At least this is according to existentialism. All right. It's comforting to know that occasionally we adults have room to make mistakes when confronted by children's existential questions and conclusions. Sometimes their way of existential knowing does not need our maturity to explain it or confirm it. You ever had a kid that just understands something? You don't need to explain it in a certain way. You can explain it like you would to a child. There's multiple different ways to explain something. So usually, however, children do need our understanding and support to know that they know, to know what they know, and to avoid double blind that can lead to self-estrangement. So, obviously we need to protect our kids, right? So we affirm the good things that they know and help cultivate that. We also help change the way they think about certain things that's going to lead them to very bad habits. This is according to Berryman. You teach a kid who wants to naturally walk in the street without looking both ways. You have to change the way they think. So through existentialism, teachers, administrators, and servant leaders are to be aware of not pressing their own beliefs they're pressing their own beliefs and opinions, rather bringing clarity and offering more knowledge to help students as they choose and discover new information. So, this doesn't necessarily mean that teachers don't share their beliefs and opinions. They just challenge and present their beliefs and opinions. They don't have to press them, though. There's a difference with trying to press and force students to think a certain way. You're challenging them to think in multiple ways. Because the idea is to get them hungry to learn. Personally, I love listening to debates, even though half the time what I'm listening to from the other person I disagree with. I really enjoy listening because it helps me grow in my understanding. And I've had changed my mind here and there about certain things. So it's really important to be able to learn and listen to somebody else's perspective. But again, as teachers, we don't want to press our beliefs and opinions. So what are the implications for curriculum? All right. Keeping in mind that existentialism focuses more on how than what, it's important in the formation. That's important when we form the curriculum. Okay. Another quote here is that existentialist teaching is necessarily oriented towards the emergence of the new. Okay, it has to be oriented towards something new. As Beeste argues, the very point of education is precisely not to repeat what is already there, but to bring something to the scene. Okay, so we're not just repeating something that someone already knows. We have to bring something new, right? You can't have the same old, same old. All right, students get bored. They don't get anything out of it. They start to think school is not important. Something new that's also important, not just something new just for the sake of new, but it's not about just the how. It's about the what. Sorry, it's not about the what. It's about the how. So curriculum should be focused on bringing about new information and how it came to be. This challenges students' current thought, which gives them an opportunity to learn. Again, there's that word challenge. We're challenging their presumptions, the things that they already think. A key item to existentialist-based curriculum is presenting the information to students rather than telling students what to think. Okay, you don't just say, "Here's what you need to know." You say, "Well, here's the information," right? And then you help them struggle through it. You guide them, and it's a journey. It's not just here, copy this, memorize this, take a test. That's not going to be an existentialist perspective. That's not going to be effective. All right. It seems another quote here from Harsma, I think. I'm not really sure. I think it's German. I think so. If that was the case, then it would be a Harsma. I'm not really sure. It seems likely then that existentialist teaching, in whatever form it takes, needs to encourage exploration by students and professors of the degrees of freedom in the classroom, while always keeping in mind the capacity of freedom to redress harms and address each other in new ways. Okay? So we have to remember, it's not just all sunshine and rainbows, like, yeah, hey, just always be challenging. No, okay? You have to make sure that we're encouraging students by exploration. Sometimes they're going to get discouraged, all right? And if we give them too much freedom, maybe they're not at that point where they can handle that. So we have to remember to address them in ways that's, push them just a little bit. If they're not ready to be pushed out of the nest all the way, well, then just hang them over the edge, or just what's gonna push them just enough to grow, but not too much to break them. So that's the idea of exploration. It's a great model because it forces students to choose to be involved. It requires active participation in getting to know something that's unknown. All right. It's just forcing them to explore, but not keep making them feel lost. Curriculum that is focused on exploration aids in discovery of new. Again, there it is, discovery of new, something new. New brings about choice of either accepting it or not, which existentialists claim is the way in which we form our realities. So, we form our reality based off of this new information. And if you think about it, obviously, we, like as Christians, we don't necessarily believe that all reality, that everything I perceive is absolutely true. But we do operate that way most of the time when we're just going about our daily lives. Whatever we're perceiving or we know, that kind of is reality to us. And we operate under the assumption. So even if it's my own perception of God and his existence and who he is, my perception of who I think God is does form how I interact. And that kind of does shape my reality, if you want to look at it that way. All right, so a couple more things here. In terms of how curriculum, as there are implications of existentialism in curriculum. So Green constantly reiterated the existential challenge to examine ourselves. What some existentialists call wide awakeness, according to Green, right, which is without the ability to think about yourself, to reflect on your own life, right? When I mentioned this quote earlier. There's really no awareness or no consciousness. So the role of education is to nurture a specific kind of reflectiveness and expressiveness and reaching out of meaningness. Basically a learning to learn. Okay. So I mentioned this already earlier, but I'm reiterating it again. That is, according to existentialists, that this has to be present. Okay. Educational, and so that's going to affect curriculum because we need to include in our curriculum that ways to teach students to learn, not just teach them information. When I teach sign language, I go about teaching sign language in a particular way. I tell people where they need to start and what's a helpful way to help build on other signs and concepts by telling them that they should first focus on certain grammatical things and learning the alphabet, so that's that. But yeah, obviously there's multiple ways to learn something, but you have to know how to learn something in order to learn it. Finally, here we have educational curriculum at its core needs to support what Green mentioned here. Existentialism is more concerned with individualistic development of a personal existence. Curriculum that has components of reflectiveness, expressiveness, meanings, and embracing the art of learning is what makes a student successful. So, let's talk about how we can manage the classroom better through existential classroom management strategies. Recent research conducted by a man named Gert Biesta led him to conclude that an existential approach to teaching leads to an approach of learning versus being taught. We've discussed this up until this point, but now here we're talking about it specifically under the umbrella of classroom management strategies. He calls this learning approach learnification. He describes this term as when a teacher becomes nothing more than a resource for knowledge in the same way that a textbook does. And then he concludes with this. On these terms, there can be no radical shift in the student's self-understanding or in how the student engages with knowledge claims, because the student already has access to the knowledge and has simply forgotten it. There is no pedagogical event. So, an existential approach to education forces the student to confront their own sources of wild resistance. Areas of their life that they have strong, deep-seated biases or preferences towards that could potentially be limiting their own learning, growth and learning. There's questions like, why am I studying at all? Am I guilty of overreaching the extent of some of my beliefs and claims? Sometimes somebody believes something, but they take it a little further than they have ground to stand on. What assumptions have I been making that I am unaware of? What about my own personal biases? You can start to unpack those things. At what point would I be willing to entertain a truth other than the truth that I already believe to be true? I think at that point, if a student can get to that point where they're willing to answer that question honestly, they can determine how much they'll be able to learn. So by existentially placing a responsibility on teachers to teach, students do not therefore relinquish their responsibility for their own education. On the contrary, students are now responsible to be able to explain and justify the validity of what they know, as opposed to simply being able to regurgitate what they know as a pool of information. Education suddenly becomes so much more rich because we have Google. So if it's just a matter of being able to regurgitate information, it's not very helpful. So this shift from information to understanding is what existentialists believe is a much more rich and beneficial way to approach education in the classroom for everybody involved. Here's our sources that we used. I will put the link to our to the actual slideshow in the comments, and so if you would like access to look at this and follow some of these links and sources to read anything on your own, feel free to do so. And with that being said, thank you very much for listening.